Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. In today's episode, James and I discuss combat encounter planning, the most basic ideas that we think that you should consider when thinking about where and how to place that fight in your session. Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs and share our experience to hopefully help you have your best game. How are you today, James?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm recovered. We had our RingCon, the big annual game convention.
Oh, right.
Which is last weekend. So a buddy of mine and I, it's at a Indian gaming casino and hotel that's like 35-40 minutes away from here. And so we get a room. And so I stayed Friday and Saturday night, which meant I was gaming from like 2 o'clock Friday afternoon till almost midnight. And then on Saturday was for like 9 a.m. to like 10 p.m. or so. I actually knocked out of a game early. And then I did a little bit on Sunday morning. So it was good, and it was a long weekend. So I'm recovered.
I understand. I managed to finally get in a session of my solo campaign last night, and
Excellent.
then we have our first session of Safari World this Friday. So,
Excellent.
yes,
All
it'll
right.
be a real traveler week for me.
That's great. Yeah, I'm excited for that. I want to hear the feedback on Safari World. You know what? Offline, I'll tell you, there was a little bit of foreshadowing that I threw into Safari World that helped cue up a little bit the Fifth Frontier War opening moves campaign that I used.
Okay.
But I'll tell you about that on the side.
Sounds good.
So we want to pick up our conversation about encounters is what
Yes.
we talked about. And you said you specifically wanted to talk about combat encounters. Because obviously there are lots of different kinds of encounters, but combat encounters in specific, I don't think we need to define those, do we?
I don't think so. I think pretty much every system, they use basically the same idea for what a combat counter is, at least in my experience with the multiple systems I've played.
Yeah, I mean it's one of these things that it's at the foundation of the vast majority of role-playing games. At some point or another, there's going to be some kind of conflict, and in most cases, I think that conflict takes the form of actual combat. So yeah, how do we go about planning good combat encounters? And you sent a couple of questions which I thought were really interesting. So do you want to just work through those and then take it where it goes?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I don't think these questions will take that long for us to talk about. So I think if we answer those and then maybe we give like an example of a combat encounter, that'd be good. So my first question is actually, I think, relatively simple, but could be more. I've had some trouble with trying to plan out combat encounters that don't feel like they're just monster of the week encounters, if you know what I mean. Or like the typical Dungeons and Dragons and there's 6 goblins in front of you.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for me to like, okay, I understand this is supposed to have meaning for the story, but how do we actually turn a combat encounter into something more meaningful than just hack and slash?
Right. Well, 2 things. One for me is, why does this encounter or scene, we can dicker over those definitions, but why does this exist in the first place? Like, is this something that, as you plan out a story, if the player characters have to make their way to, some caves that are hidden behind a waterfall where the bandits are probably hiding out and they ran off with, the city's gold or whatever. And that there are bandit guards in the in the forest around the waterfall. So it is almost certain that the party is going to get engaged in some kind of combat trying to get into the caves. Okay, so something like that. My first question is, where does this fit context-wise into the story? And like that right there. Some of it is call it like positional context. You want to go from A to C, you must go through B, and at B there is something, rather some characters or creatures that will try to stop you. and there will be some form of conflict, and it will probably be combat. So that's my first question, is just like, why is this even happening? Why could this happen? And I want it to make sense. I want it to be reasonable. You know, if you show up at the castle and you try to get into the castle, there are going to be guards at the castle.
Right.
You know, you're trying to get into the bandit hideout. There are probably going to be lookouts and guards and things like that. When it comes to, say, monsters, you know, and not like, oh, goblins, you know, hold up in the forest waylaying travelers. I'm talking about, like, I don't know, a slime or, you know, giant spiders. For me, it just has to make sense for where it takes place. Like, why would those monsters be there? Is it their lair? Is it their hunting ground? And I don't go into like long, you know, thinking about, oh, you know, their ecology and all that stuff. But I ask myself, okay, you know, when traveling through this area, would it make sense? Could it be interesting to, say, break up, like, potentially a long, either tedious or hand-waved overland travel with some kind of a, you know, something that gets in their way? Hey, you know, the forest of such and such, you know, it has lots of whatever kinds of animals or creatures.
Right.
So then they run into that animal or creature, or it disturbs their sleep or something like that. So again, it goes back for me to context. Why is it there? And it's got to make sense. One of the things that burned me out on Pathfinder, first edition, their adventure paths, and I realized this, there was a horror adventure path that they put together years ago that had some cool ideas in it, but I recognized very early, like into the second book, that there were a significant number of combat encounters in every single book that were only there to serve the master of, you have to gather up enough experience points before you make your next level, because then you get to the next encounter that's actually germane to the story, and you need to be third level by the time you reach it. It was just like, oh my gosh, do we even care about the story? So yeah, context, it's got to make sense. That's the first question. What do you think of that?
No, I think that makes sense. That's kind of, in my experience, what I've seen. I have in the past played with some people where it's like, combat is there for the sake of combat, not really even for like, you need XP gains. It's just the games are boring unless there's lots of combat.
Right.
So that was just something that I kind of wanted to pick your brain a little bit on, because that's more how I've come to understand it in the few sessions I've run, which, funnily enough, most of the stuff that I've run, combat has not been the answer to most things. It's actually usually the last thing on the list of things that people do, but it has been something that's happened. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Well, I sent you another question that I thought actually kind of goes with this.
Oh, wait a minute. I had something else.
Oh, go ahead.
Remember, I had two things I thought about.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, and then you ask that, because I think they kind of wrap together. The other thing is, so this is in deciding, why is this even taking place here? Or would it make sense to have this take place here? The context question. And then my other question is, what can I do about the arrangement of the creatures and or NPCs and the environment? Those two things together. Like, what kind of, because oftentimes when you think combat, and I think I did this, I know I did this for a very long time. You think combat, you only think of, oh, there are 5 orcs and I have 4 player characters, and on the third round of combat, I've decided that another orc is showing up. Like, that's all you think about. You think about the participants. Okay. You think about the participants in the combat, not other factors, environmental factors, or maybe plot factors that go on around it. But we can talk about that when we move into your next question.
Okay. Well, that's what my next question really is. How do you set up combat and things like this, encounters? Are they very role focused, or are there lots of other ways around situations? So just to give an example, say they're coming up to a point where this could turn into combat, it could not turn into combat. are there a lot, like, would you run it with a lot of skill checks, or is it something where it's like, it really is like, if they tell me no, we're going to like sneak here, okay, well then you need to use this type of role? Or is it like we can really like plan this out and figure out what we're going to do and try to like end this in one like go, or we're going to completely avoid things and step back and try something different? How do you handle those kind of situations?
I think I don't actually put a whole lot, maybe I ought to, but I don't know. I don't put a whole lot of thought into, I think this is how my players are going to move through what I'm deciding here. I do put some time into thinking about, okay, what are their characters like? Because on the one hand, I don't want to make the whole game like Panderfest, where you're just like, oh, you're good at sneaking around, so everything is open for sneaking around, and you're really good at being bold and like, blah, blah. I don't like that. I think that those sometimes you need to take into account, all right, what are my players' characters like, and what are their play styles like? And so I want to provide them with opportunities that challenge them, but also if they put some effort into it, will result ideally in them coming up with a really cool solution or approach that they feel good about and adds to the quality of the story at the table. So I don't put a whole lot of thought through like, well, how will my players deal with it? But I do take into account, like, for example, a good friend of mine that I've gamed with a ton over the years, and don't regularly now just because our schedules don't mesh well. But he likes to play like the paladin or the cavalier. He likes to play the noble, like heavy hand of justice knight. Whether he is that or not, that's like his foundation. And so every once in a while, I like to throw him an opportunity, like in combat or in an encounter, where he can just, he has an opportunity if he plays it right to like really crush the scumbag who deserves to be crushed. Because then I know that he'll do that in an entertaining way that will play well to his character and will be satisfying to him as a player. So I do take that kind of thing into account sometimes, but I don't take the time to try to build a series of assumptions or like guesstimates as to, well, this is how my players could, or rather should. I really don't ever want to get in that, well, I think this is how it should be played out. And then you're doing what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. You're writing a book and you're yanking the carpet out from underneath your player's agency. So I try to set up an encounter that will be interesting, challenging, rooted in meaning for the story, and then try to challenge the players to be as creative as possible. Maybe you end up having players who don't end up using combat skills or abilities because they use other things to, solve the problem while some of the other ones fight. So whether it's skill checks or attack checks or things like that, depending on the game, I don't try to anticipate that much.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I've never really thought about it in the like, I should focus on the characters. Maybe that's because my players have so far played characters that kind of fit their personalities. So it just kind of goes together. But that's something I'll have to start thinking about more as I continue in Traveller and other things that we might be doing.
Yeah, and it's not, you can overcomplicate it. You can try to like, and here's a challenge that I run into with Star Trek Adventures, which is what I'm running right now, is that in Star Trek Adventures, each character has 4 values. And these are value statements like never leave a man behind, or, there's always a peaceful solution, or whatever. They're like value statements. And the super meta currency in Star Trek Adventures, determination, you're only supposed to activate that when you are able to engage a value or the GM challenges one of your values. So let's say your value is, there's always a peaceful solution. And I push you into a corner where violence is the only option. And I say, listen, I'll give you a point of determination if you challenge your value. And there's a mechanic that's related to the experience system, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's all fine and good. That sounds terrific. The problem is, if you have 4 players around a table, that's 16 values that I, the GM, am supposed to be juggling in my mind to make sense of. So that kind of thing, that really like detailed level approach, like, oh yeah, I know you have this skill and that skill. Like in Gumshoe, there's a worksheet where you're supposed to write each of the characters' names at the top of a column, and then it has all the skill ratings, and you're supposed to mark off all their skill ratings so you can go through. It's super cumbersome. Like, it's one of these things that in theory sounds okay, but at the table when you're trying to keep things going, yeah, that I think just watching your players as their characters develop and look for the really salient points, either the things that they run to behaviorally as their characters, or maybe sometimes the things that they run from. Like, here's this thing you never go about it that way. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity to go about it that way because that might be interesting.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. That Gumshoe thing sounds terrible. I would hate that as someone who's just starting. That would be a horrible thing.
It was just super cumbersome.
Those were my 2 questions. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to.
You said, how do you handle encounters that could go to combat or not?
Yes.
And I think, okay, when I think of, okay, here are the bandits. They're in the forest. They're on either side of a little river that's, a waterfall creates, and the entrance to the bandit base is behind a waterfall. So they're on both sides. Let's say there's 3 on one side and 2 on the other, and they're set up there, whatever. My assumption is that my player characters are probably going to go in there and pick a fight, because the bandits aren't going to be okay with like having them get by, unmolested. But if my players decide like, okay, let's see if we can sneak by them, or let's see if we, and that might be really, really difficult, or let's see if we can like bluff our way by them, or do something else. There are some conflict encounters that are going to be almost certainly combat encounters. But if the players are clever, creative, and they work together enough, and maybe depending on the circumstances, they get lucky enough with their roles, then a conflict encounter might not go to combat. And I'm fine with that. There are some circumstances, I think, for the sake of the story, where you want to like push the characters into sorry, you have no choice but to fight here. That could be an interesting part of the story. But you're right that it's really easy. I remember, oh my golly, 40 years ago, playing D&D with my friend Jeff. And Jeff and I would trade off DM duties. And I remember like writing adventures, quote unquote, writing adventures. And the adventures would always like start in one place, and the adventure would take place at some other place. And there would be travel between the 2 places. And it was this one-upsmanship between he and I as to like, what kind of devilish, monsters could you put as like stumbling blocks between the adventure jumping off point and the actual adventure site. So it was like going through the monster manual and looking for like, like a snow serpent or, whatever, finding some goofy, ridiculous thing. It had nothing to do with, there was no story behind it. There was no like, there was very little tied to like, okay, you're in a forest, and so you're going to run into like foresty kinds of creatures and stuff like that. That kind of stuff. But it's really easy to treat encounters just as like, okay, I'm going to build a fight.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I asked this was because I think that there have been times where I've been presented with questions like this, but it seems so like obvious in the past games I've played where the GM wants you to go that it's kind of difficult to break out of that mold. And I think this High and Dry campaign was the first time with the scavengers that I really had that like question put before me where, players can like absolutely go one way or the other. It's completely prepped for combat, but it's also completely prepped for them to find a way around it. Yeah. And I was like, this is something I really haven't considered a lot before, that there are these complete 2 options.
Yeah. And also the cool thing about a game like Traveller, or any game where I think one of the it's like a mindless downside, which can be fine. Not every game needs to be like a serious story. In fact, I think it's best when most of them are not that serious. Like in terms of not like everyone goofing off and telling fart jokes at the table. I'm talking about like it doesn't have to be like, oh, a deep, meaningful like journey into the. Give me a break. We have enough crap to deal with in real life. I don't need to drag that in my hobbies. But I think that a game like Traveler, for example, like, yeah, your player characters could have gone in and just like kicked indoors and started shooting at people. But the consequences they would have piled up would have been absolutely dreadful for them in the future. And one of the things about fantasy games like D&D, I think, has always done this. It has always just like eliminated the consequences of murdering everybody. And so when you offer or when you open the possibility and you're thinking of like, well, you know, those bandits have cousins, or maybe like you're calling them bandits, but in the next realm, they're like,
that was Robin Hood. Sorry.
Right. Or the Count's guard. They work for the Count and they're just moonlighting, robbing people in the neighboring kingdom or something like that. And so when you step into that kingdom, now you're a wanted criminal. But yeah, when you give, sometimes I think it's good to put the pressure on players and put them in a position where it's like, this is the only solution I have. This is the only way I can go about this, unless they're really creative. Other times it's just like, hey, here's conflict. Here's the thing you have to get through and over. You figure it out. And recognize that if you choose, depending on what methods you choose, you may experience different consequences.
Yeah.
I think, though, like I've said, I think the big thing is why. Like, why is this taking place? And after you decide, like, yeah, okay, it makes sense. The bandits are going to be they're going to guard their little keep behind the waterfall. That makes sense. Okay. Now I'm going to put I don't want this to be like an overwhelming encounter because the real stuff's going to happen inside the caves. So it's not going to be like 30 bandits out there. It's going to be only a few. Okay, beyond that, how can I make this interesting? So the other things I think about is environment and what kinds of plot could feed into it. So environment, like maybe some of the bandits are in elevated positions. They are camouflaged, so they have concealment. Maybe some of them have cover as well. You know, maybe one's not really paying all that much attention. So in the first round, only 4 of the bandits will get to roll initiative, and the other one was half asleep or, you know, sharpening his, you know, something or whatever like that. There could be a plot issue to it that, all right, by the 3rd round, and I'm just checking this off, one of the bandits is going to raise an alarm. So what I try to do, and I don't always do this, but what I attempt to do at least, is put in some wrinkles and some other layers and facets that make it more than just you fight them, they fight you, you fight them, they fight you, until one side is dead. And environmental factors like layout of the room, simple things like elevation. If it is like a situation where there are guards, do they have choke points? Or if they're competent, if you're going to treat them as competent, like how have they... You have to kind of see the battleground from their perspective and think, okay, what things reasonably could they do that would increase their chances of success, or at least minimize the chances of them getting killed? And then again, are there like plot things I could circle in? Is anyone else going to show up? Can an alarm be raised? Blah, 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 things like that. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be some long checklist of this happens in the 3rd round, this happens in the 4th round, and you know, then you just complicate things. But just, you know, think, if you have a couple of guards outside of a waterfall, where could you put at least 1 or 2 of them that would be interesting and make it more challenging and make your players think? If you have to make your players think at least a little bit, I think you're succeeding.
Okay. That was actually, while you were talking there, another thing I thought about that actually I think fits with this really well is also, we've talked a lot about like time scarcity and getting players to actually think about how much time do you have to make these decisions? Because if it's something where, well, there's a guard that's hidden and you thought you were hidden and they see you immediately, that changes the time. Like, no, you're going into combat right now. Or is it a situation where it's like, well, maybe we can wait until it gets to dusk, and then maybe some of them will go back in to go to sleep and other people will come out and there'll be fewer guards.
Right.
So but that would be something where, yes, remembering environment that, hey,
Yeah.
this is something environmentally that could, like, hey, if you're willing to wait instead of just going in guns blazing right away,
Right.
maybe the combat will be easier for you or more difficult depending
Right.
on the time you do things.
Yeah, and I think for those kinds of things, you like as you're planning, like back to the bandits guarding the waterfall entrance to their secret hideout. Take a moment and think through. Okay, how would the bandits be logically set up if they're halfway competent, and how might this play out? Run the scenario through your head, like run that scene in the movie through your head, just generically. Okay, my players, their characters creep up. What if they are able to stealth up? Like one of them is able to stealth up to one of the guards and takes him out. Well, then what? Yeah, think through it a little bit, and then think reasonably, like I said, about their reactions. The monsters or the NPCs, and again, just how it would make sense. Another thing, also, I think is really important, and like nobody ever does this, is under what circumstances will the enemy flee or surrender? That's another like murder hobo thing in D&D that no one ever the orcs never give up. What if they do? Or what if the brigands decide to run? What if the brigands decide to give up? Those, even if you don't even have to do that often, like in a fantasy setting, I think if you were to do that periodically, that would be enough of a surprise to your players. They're not fighting to the death, or maybe they already have an escape plan made. And you don't need to do that all the time. It just varies it enough, because the norm is everybody fights to the death, which is kind of absurd, actually. Everyone stands their ground and fights to the death. They don't fall back, Yeah,
there's no regrouping.
No, which is ridiculous.
RPGs very often, which makes ridiculous. No sense. Yeah.
Something also to flip that around on the players is, I personally think it's totally fine, and if it works for the story, to present your players with overwhelming odds. To put them in a combat situation, or a situation that they lead into combat and it is not winnable.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's something that you communicate to your players if that's what you're interested in. Like, I recommend that, because that can increase the drama and the idea of the player characters. Like, it's time to run. This is stupid. The storm giant is going to crush us. We need to run. Maybe that's something that you communicate to your players in advance. Hey, listen, in this campaign, you may come across encounters. You may get in fights or find yourself in situations where withdrawing, regrouping, and surviving are your best options, where standing your ground is not going to be a great idea.
I think I can use this as an example. I don't think he would mind me ripping this off from the first D&D campaign I ever played, but my first GM did a really good job of doing this. I think it was either the second or the third adventure encounter that we ran, where he stuck us on an island, so there was no way for anyone to escape. You didn't have an option. And then basically was like, okay, there are two beholders. You have to figure out how to get them to stop fighting without going into combat, because you're level 2. And it was actually pointed something out to us like, hey, you're going to run into things that you can't actually beat in a head-on struggle. And it did a really good job of pointing out, like, maybe there are times that we should run. He made sure we couldn't run in this situation because he wanted us to think about it and try to figure things out. But that is something that I think is really important, especially if you're going to do a longer form campaign.
Sure.
Is show people, like, there are ways to think, to use your brain instead of your arm to figure this out. So
yeah, I think overall the approach is, think conflict first, and combat is the most common form of conflict. But conflict first, and depending on where it if it fits in the story. If it doesn't fit in the story and it makes no sense whatsoever, like, I think it's okay to say, like, okay, well, so the party is traveling through this like lawless, savage land, whatever. And they just get attacked in a marketplace by some thugs. That has nothing to do with the story, but it actually kind of does, because it reinforces the danger of their immediate context. So even something like that can fit. Like, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're going to Duke Smorgledorf's keep to whatever, but it does reinforce the story. But I think if you can find no other reason for a fight than a fight, it's probably not a good idea to include it. But then beyond that, again, it's a question of, well, how do you want to push it on the players? Is it more likely this is going to end up in a fight, or is it just, again, conflict that could go anyway, depending on how the players react? But I would encourage, and I would reward creative play at the table, depending on how they approach things, because that just makes things more interesting. And then also, there are a lot of games. It was interesting over the weekend. I played in a 2D20 game called Dishonored, which is based off of some video game that I know nothing about. I
actually know the video game.
Okay,
so.
All I know is it's like dreary and British, and we were the jackbooted cops who were arresting people for memes. Is pretty much what we were. But that version of 2D20, you have your attributes, and then you have styles, which I think is a little goofy, but whatever. Those are the two things you add together. Like you could fight swiftly or fight boldly, whatever. The GM had a house rule where he said that outside of combat, you can't use the same combination twice in a row. Which I thought was very clever, because it forced us to not just treat everything like a nail and our character like a hammer.
Right.
So, if you give players other things to grab onto in a combat encounter, environmental or plot wise, or like, say, the time pressure thing that you talked about, you can encourage them over time to develop the reflex of being like, well, I'm really great with my broadsword, but I can do these other things too. And so in this situation, I'm going to use other aspects of my character. And then that just becomes more interesting.
Right. No, that makes sense. I'm going to have to see how I can incorporate this into the future, because like I said, I'm doing this written campaign, or this written adventure, and then we'll see what comes next. And I'm interested to see kind of how that works out and see if I can do that with something else, because from what I've noticed, there's a lot of combat built into these pre-written adventures that is like, it's on a table that if you roll a certain thing, you get this combat encounter. And it's like, that's not as interesting, because there's no real thought that goes into it. It's just,
this happens.
You rolled a 10, therefore you're in combat now.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, not hip on that. And like I said, with Traveler, the wonderful thing with that as a setting trope is that in many cases, combat's not your first option. In fact, it's not even on your top list of options. And when it is, it tends to be your only option. Like it's been forced on you, or these people are really the baddies, and we have to. They're gonna start shooting. We know that, so we should start shooting first.
Right.
And that will help you in that respect. You did have another question you had asked about random encounters. I think we can talk about that in another episode, because I don't factor those into combat. Like I like to have an idea again as to why does this fit into the story, and then I shape it based on my view for how it fits.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really only asked that question because I've never seen someone use random encounters really well, which doesn't mean that it's not something that you could do. It just seems to be an extra level.
You know what? Nor have I. I have at times, and very rarely, just rolled on some random encounter tables while planning. Thinking, maybe something. Ooh. Maybe this will just throw an idea at me, and I'll go, what could I do with that? But I've never been one to sit there at the table and I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen. Let me roll a die.
That makes sense, actually.
That's never been my thing.
Yeah, that actually helps me a lot with this planning for Safari World, because they do have some random encounters, and I actually like that. I've never thought about I'm just going to roll the random encounters myself and decide that before the session.
Even do this, while you're planning, roll a couple of different results and then think through each. And if any of them make sense to you or inspire you in some way or another, then use that. Boom. You've used a resource. They've provided it with you. Here's provided it for you. You can put it to use, but you don't need to use it right then and there. Yeah, the players are enough of a random and chaotic element in the games anyway. I don't need some table from a publisher throwing more weird stuff in there that I can't make sense of on the fly.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, cool then. Let's do this next time. Let's talk about other kinds of encounters that are likely to not result in combat. And we can figure that out then. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I'm really interested in that one.
Cool. All right. Well, so when are you running the first session of Safari World?
So this Friday.
Excellent. All right. Very good. So actually, this Friday will be last Friday when people listen to it because of the episodes that we've got scheduled. But that's very cool. So then we can talk a little bit about how that went too, the encounters and combat encounters. Otherwise, we can use that as a bridge into encounters in general.
Perfect.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes.